Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Thank you. I want to thank Shai and Francis and his team for asking me here tonight. It's a great opportunity to meet you, and I've really been looking forward to this. And talk about Dream Team. Well, 20 minutes to talk about building a dream team is not long, but as I once suffered a lecture on for 3 hours on the advantages of brevity, I think I'll probably meet the challenge. Now, sadly, my experience comes not from building an entrepreneurial company from scratch like Billy. I come from the other end of the telescope, is that my experience comes from what happens when they go drastically wrong. So, as Otto von Bismarck once said, only a fool learns from his own mistakes. A wise man learns from other people's mistakes. On that basis, I'm going to share some of my experiences with you, and I hope that you find them useful. I want to start by, I'm wired. I want to start by defining what a dream team is. And we all have this image of this sort of lean team, charismatic, full of chemistry, group of people who are moving things along rapidly, getting it to early revenues, and any dissension is resolved by meaningful debate. And there's no doubt that those exist. But they tend to be small teams, and in my experience, they tend to have a limited life. They're quite ephemeral, maybe a couple of years. The only team, actually, that I've seen that's lasted longer than that is this one, Star Trek. And so there you have it. I'm studying archaeology, if some of you don't know. So I'm an archaeologist and a Trekkie, which is about as sad as it gets, I think. But I don't believe that dream teams materialize out of this primeval soup of chemistry and charisma. I think in larger companies, they're the result of extremely hard work, some mistakes, and professional management. So my idea of a dream team is more like a Premier League football club. The right people for the job, doing their job, and succeeding at their job. But to get to that point, I think there are a lot of building blocks that you've got to put in place. And I can only cover what I think is the most important, and I'm sure you'll all have your own ideas about that. But for me, the starting place and probably the most fundamental building block is actually a commercial strategy. And by that I mean the aims of how you're going to get to revenue generation and how you're going to get there. And biotechnology, which has been my field of experience in particular, has made a lot of famous and expensive mistakes. Mostly because they failed to build sustainable strategies for their businesses. So you've had companies that have underestimated the length of time it takes to get a drug to fruition, or they've been over-optimistic about clinical trial results. But companies need to make money at some point in the foreseeable future, and I stress foreseeable. Investors will continue to support and fund companies that deliver against milestones, who have a pathway to revenues. Now, because there's nothing more off-putting for a team building situation than actually having stop-start funding. You won't keep your good people, and you won't attract good people into the business. Now, I'm sorry if I'm stating the blindingly obvious, but once you've got this strategy, you can actually put in place a very good and appropriate organization structure, and then you can recruit and outsource and train against that. I've seen so many of the young biotech companies put so much financial and emotional investment into their technology that commercial positions become an expense and not an investment. Now, I had the privilege of working a few years ago with a company called Smart Holograms. It was an organization of 45 people. From the day it's got its first research grant to the point that I became involved, it had had £19 million worth of investment. And at that stage, it was still 5 years away from having any product they could market, let alone get revenues. Now, Smart Holograms is a phenomenal technology. It was created here at Cambridge University. It was spun out from Cambridge Enterprise, and it had a lot of applications that were commercial. The problem here was that they viewed their core business as medical devices. So when I arrived, I was the first commercial person through their door. They had 1 month's cash left and a £500,000 a month burn rate. Their pilot plant was in boxes in the basement with a field trial deadline of 8 months away. And of those 45 people, 30 of them were PhDs and technicians, and the balance were admin people. So we did some adjustment to the strategy. There was an anti-counterfeiting application of the technology, which was big news at that. I mean, anti-counterfeiting measures are big even now. And we also looked for a joint venture for the medical device aspect of it. And by doing that, we were then able to recruit the right people, like an operations director who was taking charge then of the production and the purchasing that we needed to get on with it. But we didn't just recruit. We had a terrific team of people already there. So we did some basic training, like how to hold a meeting and time management. We gave project management training to the scientific managers that were in there, and we introduced coaching. And what I found in that was that as we started to achieve milestones and deadlines, I mean, I had a conversation early on where one of the guys said to me, "We've never missed a deadline." And I said, "No, because you've moved the date every time you've gotten close to it." But as we managed to achieve that, confidence grew. The team became more cohesive, and it was tangible, the change in the culture in the entire building. And 8 months in, we actually got investment offers that valued the business at 40 million. We actually had 2 of those, and this is a pre-revenue business. So it wasn't bad going, and in a fairly short time, we'd actually turned that round. And I think the point here is that once you've got a commercial strategy, and you've got a framework then on which you can hang your organisation structure. Now, I've seen so many small companies just grow. You know, we need somebody else, we need to do that. And one of the things I think is really important to be aware of at that stage when you are beginning to grow is A, have a structure so you're not just spending a lot of money willy-nilly, but B, is to be aware of the resetting of boundaries. Now, at the outset, everybody's multi-skilled. You buy the computers, you raise the funding, you make the tea, even in some cases clean the loos. But as you become bigger, a lot of those jack-of-all-trades can become sidelined. And a good example of this was a small phytopharmaceutical company in Germany. Now, phytopharmaceuticals are drugs where the drug target has come from herbs. Now, this company, only 10 people, the production manager had been there from the start, and he'd invested a lot of time and passion in understanding how this herb grew in India, what was the optimal time to harvest, and how you processed that through to an injectable drug. They built to a point where the CEO then brought in an agronomist, a specialist agronomist, not realizing the passion and investment that the production manager had put into this. And the CEO rang me at the point at which they'd had a punch-up in the corridor. So the lesson I took from that was it's best to deal with it before the smell of smouldering mortar sets the fire alarms off. The other thing that I'd like to talk about is recruitment. We are very good at recruiting experienced people, but I would like to suggest that attitude and skills are as important as past experience. Now, I worked with a venture capital company that recruited the very best money had to offer. Clinical development directors, regulatory directors, the lot. They recruited them from the US, from Europe, and they recruited the best, these people at the top of their game, earning huge amounts of money. And can anyone here guess what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, because most of them had been so far beyond being operational that they'd forgotten how to roll up their sleeves and get stuck in. About the only thing that happened there was a lot of shouting. So yes, experience is really critical, but having the right attitude, I think, is important. I once worked with a guy who came in on the stroke of 9 and he went home on the stroke of 5, and then took a week off with stress because he had to work a 37-hour week instead of a 35-hour week. Now, you can't blame him. They were his contracted hours. But with attitudes like that, you're never going to build a really dream team. That attitude just isn't going to be there. And he's not going to be happy either. And that was one of my mistakes. I never did manage to find out what incentivized him. Which brings me to HR practices. I advocate very early use of HR professionals. If you're not big enough to recruit somebody of your own, go and talk to the experts that are out there on an outsourced basis. I guarantee that they save you money, ultimately, and using those processes actually help build your team. I will just give you one sort of cautionary tale here about incentives. Now, bonuses are a bit of a touchy subject anyway at the moment, but I once worked with a company where all the people in the company had achieved their individual targets, but all their individual targets achieved didn't add up to the corporate goal being achieved, which meant that they couldn't pay bonuses, and that caused an absolutely huge issue. And that's where HR advice, once you begin to build, becomes extremely valuable. Now, for me, the other key building block is your board, and there are 3 elements to that. And the first one is your investors. Now, I could go on for the next fortnight about investors, but finding a venture capital company that understands your sector is critical. My advice would be to go for as long as possible without them, or preferably not at all. But if you are going to have them, having one that really is experienced in that is important, because they understand management process. Get the wrong one, and I've seen them destroy businesses, and I think that's a very important part. Nothing demoralizes a team quicker than stop-start funding. I think I said that earlier, but it's worth repeating. And your board need to be on side with what you're trying to do with your team, as well as all the usual stuff. I think it's worth making them aware and having their support about where you're trying to take your team. And last of all is you, as an entrepreneur. I think the ethos and the culture of the company comes from your touch as a leader. And yes, some of the most famous entrepreneurs have all the team building skills of Attila the Hun. You know, Richard Branson, Chris Evans in the biotech sector, or Alan Sugar. But all of them are smart enough to have people behind them that do know how to build companies. So if you're a scientist, business skills don't get acquired by osmosis. I think you need to spend some time. There are very few naturals in this, and equally if you're a business person, as I was, in a science company, then actually understanding the technology and understanding the whole process of that is fairly critical. There's a lot of cross-education that's got to happen. Now, I'd like to tell you about the best teams that I worked with, and they all came from one company called Sonova. Sonova was a biotechnology hero in the 90s. They successfully floated. They made acquisitions of various drugs at various stages, and that was seen as a sustainable strategy, having a pipeline of drugs in development. But sadly, and as has often happened in the biotech sector, the good news slowed. There were no convenient breakthroughs at the quarterly results. There were no positive clinical trial outcomes at the year end. So the share price dropped, money started to run out, and they couldn't fund their drug development programs, added to which they had the burden of Sarbanes-Oxley. They were a hair's breadth from administration when Celtic Pharma took them out, and I joined that team at that stage. So, and I will just say something here about floating too early. when I went in there, Zenova's budget for sustaining dual listing and supporting all the lawyers and advisors was more than the rest of the company's budget put together. So in a pre-revenue company, floating too early will give you a burden that it is extremely difficult to get beyond, and I think threatens your success as a business. So my objective at Zenova was to salvage the best of the development programs, to sell off the rest, and to discontinue some if we couldn't sell them. Inevitably, there were going to be redundancies, and we were going to close large pieces of the business. And it's one of those occasions when the role CEO actually stands for Chief Execution Officer. But we were honest. We were clear and upfront about what had to happen with all of this. And we also incentivized the key people to stay for at least a year until we could actually sort all of that out. Now, I worked with a much depleted team in Slough. And even through the most difficult times, these people were performing, professional, and very successful. And I actually went on to work with some of them in later projects, but they maintained that even though they were working themselves out of a job. And I think we achieved as much chemistry and forward positive thinking then as I have with any team, in actual fact, and it was a real privilege to work with them. The other part of the team was Zenova Biomanufacturing here in Cambridge, and they were scheduled for closure. The consultants advising Celtic said just close that off. But actually when we had a look at it, there was a real sustainable business model in there. And I'm really delighted to say that one of those team members that was there became the CEO, and under Jim Mill's leadership, that's a really successful biomanufacturing company. And it's a delight to work with any one of those teams. And if it demonstrates nothing else, I think it shows a very clear strategy and some common goals and some shared values, as Shai was talking about, can go an awfully long way, even in the most difficult circumstances. Now, we see dream teams trying to be built every day in the Premiership League. You see the buying and selling of players, the investment they put into it, the sacking of managers. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that we buy and sell employees in certain windows, or we fire managers at the same rapidity, although in biotech sometimes it does seem like that. What I am suggesting is that, like Sir Alex Ferguson, if you provide the leadership and the framework and the right commercial goals, then dream teams can build out of that. So I just want to end by summarizing what I've said here. Clear, communicated commercial strategy, an appropriate organization structure where you can train people who are there, recruit and outsource. Recruit experience and attitude and skills. Use the full suite of HR tools at your disposal. And probably the biggest challenge of all is to get investors, the board, and you right. So if any of you are thinking about starting up a company, I hope this has been useful, and I want to wish you the very best of luck. Thank you.
Technology.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Billy Boyle. What I was going to do tonight was tell you a little bit about our company, Owlstone, and talk a little bit about the journey we've had in growing the company and the team that we've assembled and how we went about doing that. If you've got any comments or questions, you can submit them here and they'll pop up at the end. So our company, Owlstone, is a spin out from Cambridge. I used to sit there about 7 years ago. So myself and two other guys, David and Andrew, founded the company back in 2004. We make microchip gas sensors. So basically think of an electronic nose that you can reprogram to detect a very broad range of chemicals. You can use this in a range of applications, things like detection of explosives, right through to even detecting disease and illness by looking at chemicals on the breath. There's some stuff about that on the BBC website today, some of you may have seen. We take our little chip, we put it into instrumentation, which does something useful for a customer, and then we try and sell that. Our initial focus has been very much on the security side of things, but also looking at industrial process control. So when you're manufacturing food and beverages, looking at contamination and taints during that manufacturing process. So today we have 43 people, so I'd say we're kind of still early-ish stage in terms of the company and what we want to do with it. Over the years, we've raised $13 million worth of investment, and we have focused quite heavily on actually commercializing the technology. I've got some good contracts from the US government. Now, so when Shai said what the topic was, I was trying to think back about the process that we went through trying to build the team. And while the context of Enterprise Tuesday is about entrepreneurship, everyone in this room at some point will have to build a team, and whatever organization that you're in, you'll have to hire and fire people. So it's not just about starting companies. It is a critical element in every enterprise that you can work in. And I was kind of trying to think of a nice little checklist, do these 4 things, and you get an awesome team at the end. I was reminded of a story called The Soul of a Carrot, where carrots are good for you. You eat them, they're good for you. So scientists thought, right, let's make a pill that has all the goodness of carrots. So they extracted like 15 carotines, put it in a pill, started giving it to people. It doesn't actually do anything particularly useful. So the reductionist approach to things doesn't always quite work. And I think that's especially the case when you're trying to build a team, where it's not a case where you do the checklist and you get the good output out the back end of it. I think there's a huge amount of subtlety and interdependencies and path dependency, which makes it very difficult. And because it's difficult, that means you should think about it a lot, because it's the most significant choices you'll have to make within your organization are usually around the people that you'll be working with. So we started, here's David and Andrew. Is that a pointer? David, Spanish guy, big hair. Andrew, American guy, and me on the end there. At the start, it's easy. You know what goes on inside your head, so you know what you can do. You've got good friends. You know what they do because you've been working with them in a research context for a few years. So the founders you start a business with, it's kind of easy. We actually, our lab is if you go up there and down the stairs. That's where the 3 of us were based. After a little while, you can't do everything yourself. You need to start hiring people. Our original hiring policy was very much centered around taking people to the pub, plying them with booze, and seeing if we liked them, and then hiring them. It was always a given that they would be technically competent. It was more about the fit. And the thing about a small team is you always know what everyone else is doing. So you know what projects are being worked on, what stage things are at. So this is us. I think this is our first anniversary. So here's me. I'm throwing a bit of chorizo. This is Russell. He's our head of chemistry. He's trying to catch a chorizo in his mouth. This is Matthew, and this is Alistair. And they're watching to see if Russell catches the chorizo in his mouth. So as you can see, everyone in the organization knows what's happening at any given time. This was our Christmas party. In the early stages, it's incredibly intense because, we were working very long hours, and then you go out afterwards and spend your evenings talking about work still. So it's very intense, and everyone has a kind of shared vision. A nice analogy I heard for the early days is a bit like having co-conspirators. You're conspiring to change things, to do something a bit different. And your early team are the co-conspirators. So this is us a little while later. And when you get to around 10, I would say just less than 10 people, something definitively changes. You notice it. The organization comes alive. And I remember thinking it was very strange at the time that we now talked about the company as an entity, which wasn't us individually. It was, things were done that you didn't necessarily know about, which is a good thing on the whole. But it was different. So you need to figure out a way in which to now manage this organization where you don't know what the person beside you is now doing. Now, there's different ways in which you can do this. The standard thing is trying to impose rules. Must do this. That's often not the best way in which to motivate people. Now, in the very early days, it becomes important to define the core values of your organization. This acts as the kind of rails for the behaviors and the things that you want to see people doing within the organization. And we were lucky, everyone that worked with us in the early days were good people, and that matters. And the CEO we hired in, Brett, had a massive amount of integrity, and those types of things matter. Because once you lay the foundation of the core values of the company, it's locked in. And you see it. We work with a lot of different organizations, big and small, and you see differences in the mindset of the organization, which is basically placed there on day one. So one of the things, we were from an academic background, and because we needed to make microchips and actually do chemistry development, stuff like that, we needed those technical skills in the early days. But we also were a commercial organization. That was our primary function. So because we're hiring a lot of PhDs, we essentially went through this deprogramming exercise for them. Said, the values that were important in an academic context are not necessarily important in a commercial context. In the commercial sphere, it's easy. Make a box, sell it. That's it. That's the extent of your job. So things like publishing papers were not, we emphasize they are not valuable contributions to the company. They might be in the context of how you market a product, but in and of itself, it wasn't a thing that we emphasized. Intellectual honesty is something that you have to have. Big organizations, you see it a lot, where people are afraid to speak truth to power. And the thing is, facts are facts. It doesn't matter what you do to them, they still exist. So within the organization, there has to be the ability for the person at the bottom to say to the guy at the top, or the person at the top, bullshit, I think that's wrong. And if you can't do that, the seeds for long-term growth and success are probably not there. You have to have intellectual honesty. One of the things that we find in business is that you can make almost anything sound plausible. You could take position one, give some justification for it. That sounds reasonable. Say the absolute opposite, give some justification. It also sounds reasonable. Trying to do things like use data, use analytics to help drive insight, to keep yourself honest. So there's the openness aspect, but there's also the use of information. Attitudes to failure. So there was an organization that we've worked with, and you see the project managers, and the engineers would say, this isn't going to work because of the laws of physics, basically. And the project manager would be stomping their feet saying, this isn't acceptable, get it in on time, I don't want to hear this. Which is not at all constructive. Failure, stuff not working, is your feedback mechanism. So, an analogy from your body, it's a bit like your white blood cells come back saying, right, my leg's chopped off, scab it up or whatever. So, bad news from every person within the organization are your white blood cells, and you should listen to them say, let's do something about it. Huffing and puffing about it will do absolutely nothing, except just delay the inevitable point at which your leg turns gangrenous and get it chopped off. Approach to hiring. So in management books, they talk about A people and B people and C, and this whole alphabet of different people. Basically, A people are good. You want them, and everyone else, can go work for someone else, work for a big organization. Now, one of the things that you should strive to do is make your job irrelevant or make yourself less relevant by trying to hire people better at your job than you. So quite early on, I was doing the microchip design. I actually wasn't very good at it. So I was like, right, we should probably get someone that knows what they're doing. So Matthew joined us, and unbelievably talented, total professional, kicked ass at that job. And I was sitting thinking, right, what do I do now? But the point is, when you think about the organizational entity, it's the contribution that is made in aggregate that matters. So you see people that try to protect their own job, if you like, by hiring people who are not better than them. And then you create a wave throughout an organization where you're not using the best people. You're not actively seeking out the best people. Get people who are smarter than you. And if you're incentivized at the organizational level, things will work out well. Otherwise, Napoleon Dynamite and Pedro will be doing your electronics design. So if you jump forward a couple of years, this is us now. We have 43 people. Rather disappointingly, the beer cans on the table are no longer there. As the organization grows, you have to do things differently. So the kind of approaches that we're taking to doing things needed to change. You need to become more professional as an organization, have more process, have more structure. Now, organizational structure does become very important. And one of the points that was made was about, you can have a jack of all trades, but, it becomes more efficient over time to have specialization. So people who, awesome at a job will do that job and do it well. Again, this will increase the health of the organization. The problem with a rigid hierarchy like this, it's, your imposition of what you think should happen. Awesome person here, should direct these people, and, great stuff happens. The problem is reality doesn't often look like that. So what you want to happen won't necessarily happen. So when you look at organizational structures and where influence actually resides within your organization, it's worth keeping your eyes open for those types of things. So, just because you give someone a job title doesn't mean that, the respect of the peers will be commanded. So you should look at, who people go to for certain problems. Who do they speak to, for going out organizing social events and those types of things. So by looking at the kind of hidden structure within your organization, it gives you a better idea of how you can move pieces to best work for the people that you have internally. So, what you want to impose more often not won't be what you get. So I'm an electronic engineer. If any of you are familiar with Boolean logic, I have a variant that we've been using in the hiring process. And also, I like 2x2 matrices. So for MBAs in the room here, here's my 2x2 matrix. Smart people are smart and therefore opinionated a lot of the time. Now, there's a fine line between having strong views and just being an arse. You also have other people who are unbelievably productive, like ninjas. They go out, they strike these problems down. They get the job done. So we have a rather simplistic scoring criteria. So, if you're a ninja and not an arse, fine, that's what we want. If you are an artist and not a ninja, you're gone. And you should do it quick. So this is one of the things that we learned. You know, as soon as you get an inkling of things, you should act fast, because you can bet other people within the organization also think the same thing. It's not fair on them for other people, for them to be picking up the slack. It's a bit more difficult when you look at people who are incredibly productive but a slight art, and vice versa. You just need to look at it a bit more. Some people do say, any arsonists, get rid of them. And there's actually, you should read Tony Blair's book if you want to get some management insight. It's very interesting. Being a prime minister, you got to manage a lot of people, so it's not totally surprising. But he once asked Alex Ferguson, so he would ask different CEOs and sports people about management. And he asked Alex Ferguson about, if you had an incredibly talented player, but someone who's incredibly difficult, what would you do? And he said, get rid of them. So there's where the dial sits on how your organization gets impacted in terms of productivity in this mix of how people fit within culturally is something that you should keep an eye on. But act fast is the one thing you should do. So motivating people, there's different levers that you can pull for people to do stuff. Have some money, have some share options. Now, I think what we've found, we've kind of rooted around and looked in literature a bit as well to try and see, is there any easy solutions? Those conventional things tend not to be the things that get our people most excited. Yes, you need to eat, but one of the observations that I made leaving Cambridge, so as an engineer, stuck with engineering, a lot of my engineering colleagues went to the city, worked for banks, management consultants. They got paid a lot more than I did, but were miserable every second of the day. So it wasn't just down to the conventional levers of motivation. I think one of the things that we did within our company more by chance. So, we were inexperienced. We don't know how to manage people. We didn't know how you set up manufacturing, for instance. So what that means when you do hire people in is that you're reliant on them, and they have a very high degree of autonomy. What we find is when people have autonomy, you're not looking over their shoulder the entire time. That is a massive motivator. So the organization will define the framework, for what you want to do. Make box, sell box. But the actual functions that are happening within the organization, we take a fairly hands-off approach. And that autonomy and people being able to get really good at their jobs, they tend to be the things that actually get them up out of bed. And I think that's what gets me up out of bed in the morning as well. I don't really think about the financial aspects particularly. So that's the end. Happy to take any comments, questions. Be self-aware. So, early on in our company, we thought, right, we know how to do technical stuff, chips and all that type of thing. We didn't have industry access or experience in trying to commercialize, certainly with things like US military. So we hired in a CEO who did have that experience and access. So I think it's a case of, it's the kind of not wanting to land grab, if you like, within the organization. So having enough self-awareness about what you can and can't do, but then also realizing when your desire conflicts with what is right for the organization. Not being an art.
Cynthia, you faced similar situations, I guess.
Yes, I have, and usually I've gone in when the venture capital companies have just removed the CEO stroke founder. And I think there are a number of things. One is that if you want to stay in control of your business, you know, keep it small. You know, try to avoid institutional funding. Venture capitalists will want professional managers in there. I think it's a great shame when you lose the founder out of the business because you lose the original flair and inspiration out of that. I think Bill is absolutely spot on. As founders, particularly if you're coming from the technical aspect of the business, which is most often the way, is to look at the role you can have in the company. I mean, for some people, they're very clear about it. They have lots of fun. And Chris Lowe from the university here is a classic case in point. He knows that he's good at coming up with new ideas and creating new businesses. I think he's created probably more companies than any other academic in this country. But that's what he does, and that's all he does. And he sits as a non-exec on those businesses. And you know, I think as Billy might concur, being a CEO is not a bowl of cherries. You know, it's not necessarily. I mean, you take the blame for everything, and the kudos for when you do get things right has to go to your team. So if you are a founder, be honest with yourself about what your strengths and weaknesses are, and have in your own mind about where you would be in that company going forward. I think they're great at letting you know what you're good at. I think in telling you how you perform as a team, it can give you an indicator. I don't think it is any good in terms of the chemistry and the gelling and the attitudes always that you get in a team. I did a management course in Switzerland with Imade. There were 11 of us. 10 of the 11 were Shaper. I don't know if you still get that. It's quite an old Belbin team profiling, which is sort of the A alpha male type profile. So there was no other way that they could really split us into appropriate teams, and a lot of shouting got done, but actually we did achieve our targets. So I think they're of limited value, actually. I think taking them down the pub is as good a guide as a Myers-Briggs.
I heard a saying one time, I think it's one of the VC sayings, that a bad team can take a good product and make it fail, and a good team can take a bad product and have a fair crack at the whip with it. Like, the experience is almost a given. It's what's there on the CV. So you assume everyone is in the same bucket on your pre-filter, if you like. Especially for technical skills. If you're looking for an electronic engineer, you should have done electronic engineering. So I think the attitude component does become critical. And I think, the pub thing did work for us very well. And one of the behaviors that we reward quite a lot is people doing things that's not necessarily their job. So our manufacturing manager is brilliant. I came in one morning and he was taking the milk bottles out for recycling. So little things of attitude, I was over the moon at that. So I said, that's awesome, because it's about thinking about contribution to the organization and not what can I do for myself and what can I take from this organization. So I think finding the attitude is harder because it's more invisible, certainly at the stages of interview, but it's the thing that's worth trying to uncover through taking them out, letting them speak to a lot of people within the company, doing those types of things.
I found that clock watching is one of the good indicators I look at. I mean, I've been into a couple of larger companies that have been in trouble where morale is low. And, you know, there's a traffic jam at the gate at 9 o'clock and there's a traffic jam at the gate at 5. And, you know, I look out the window at those times as we're moving through with some of the recovery stuff, just to check, who's there. But I think it is, it's just as Billy said, you know, I liked his arse scale. I liked his scale. But I also like, and you can tell when somebody's being an arse, they're not sharing information. You know, they're not playing that game when everybody's busting a gut to get things right and to work there. They're the ones that are holding back, and they're not sharing, and they're looking out for number one. And one of the interesting things is that I often find, I liked very much Billy's informal network, his organisation structure that looked like a spider's web. In rescue situations, I've used Grapevine, and actually understanding who those informal key influencers are in the business is important. And it's important if those key influencers are negative. It's important you understand who they are. I remember in one of the companies, and I won't say who it was, there were 3 of the young academics that had been part of the founding team. They weren't the founders, but part of the founding team. And they hadn't got their directorships out of it. They were still managers, and as we brought in more team, they were moving in structure down the organisation. And I got hold of them one day and I sat them in a room and I said, do you realise the impact you guys are having on this organisation? And they wanted it to succeed, but they just didn't realise that those little negative, snidey comments were having such a demoralising effect. But by getting a hold of them, we actually started to turn that round a bit. So I think these informal networks and these influential people are really important, and it's important that you identify it. But you'll know, you know, you'll get gut instincts about people fairly early on.
We didn't find it particularly helpful. Actually, there was one occasion where we got some very honest feedback that saved us from making a mistake. But, you know, it's a self-selecting group. You know, you're not going to put someone that hates you on as your reference. You know, you're going to put your mum down if you can. So the information, you don't expect surprise from it. So we do follow it up just in case. You do hear something negative, because if you hear something negative there, then there's usually something very wrong. But we tend, as a way of finding people, we had some bad experiences with recruiters, where recruiters will tell you anything to get their commission. You know, yes, this person has a skill set, it's not, you know, you're an idiot, they can't do that stuff. So we try to use personal networks as much as possible. So a recommendation that comes from a previous organization, we like, because that person has seen, you know, the other person in a close context for a long period of time, and they rate them. So it's a kind of transitive effect. If the person that works for us, we rate them, and they rate someone else, you get some of the love back.
Yeah, I found them of limited use. I think one of the interesting things about recruiting in the United States is that it's actually illegal to run a reference system in the same way that we do here in the UK. But what you'll get from recruiters and good professional recruiters in the US is they will get companies to list strengths and weaknesses of that particular individual. Now, I actually found that was quite useful in follow-on interviews to sort of just prod a bit further about all of that. And I think having a conversation like that with a referee, as opposed to getting them to trot out the usual trite nonsense, is a lot more useful. than a straightforward written reference that said this person's wonderful. Only once did I ring up about the reference and they said, no, they're rubbish, don't don't recruit them. You think, and this is a reference. But in general, the written ones are valueless, I think.
I have one comment about people's CVs, actually.
People's CVs, yeah. Please.
Yeah, like showing humility in past achievements. So you get, we call them I invented fire CVs. You know, in my last job, I sold a gazillion and invented fire in my spare time. You know, the attribution for what you achieve within an organization is set within the context what the organization is doing. So we quite like humility within CVs as a way to filter you know, behaviors that we appreciate within our own organization.
I think I've never experienced pressure to recruit family, but I think it does beg the question about cronyism. You know, people that you're working with will have their own personal networks, their own idea of who's great and, you know, who they've got great chemistry with. And I think you need to be quite careful about that. And that's where having a good, I know this is really boring, it sounds really boring stuff, but a good job description, understanding what it is you need about that person to succeed in that job. You know, who have they got to work with in the organisation, not just about, you know, whether they're great in designing chips or not, but how do they interact? What's their style of interaction with other people? Which is why the pub test is such a great one, you know, watching them interact with others. But I would not comply with any pressure to recruit certain people. No, whether family or cronies.
Yeah, we've never had family, but I agree with you on the cronies. So you will get people say, you know, I know someone will be a brilliant non-exec or whatever. Like, the rule that we apply is, like the kind of ninja axis, is be productive. So if you do something productive, then there will be consideration of it. But if it's not, if it's just, you know, someone who knows someone or, you know, advice or whatever, then no. So again, I think what every organization should strive to do is remove yourself from the success of the company. So, you know, we're engineering geeks, so we like process, you know, all that type of stuff. So, you know, the organization would function if we weren't there, for sure. I hope so. I think it's just, it's more through action as opposed to saying stuff. So we don't say, you know, we want to be blah, blah, blah. You know, you see the measure of people by what they do. So similarly in terms of, you know, what the long-term vision for the company will be, I think it's just staying the course on that. So saying it and doing it and not deviating from that.
I have found bringing in HR professionals mean that you deal with the problems in the right legal way. You know, most technical companies now are working across international boundaries. You're working in a lot of different jurisdictions. So being able to deal with non-performance and contractual issues, I think is really, really important that you've got that HR advice in there. I think you've got a whole suite of things in the HR toolbox. And, you know, I mean, we have a poor image of personnel still, I think particularly in the UK, but a good HR professional is going to be saying, you know, whispering in my ear. You know, if it wasn't my finance director whispering in this ear, it was my HR lady whispering in this ear, saying, do you know that so-and-so's not quite happy with this? And, you know, the feedback that you don't get, because sometimes people just don't want to tell you that stuff when you're turning around a business, can sometimes often come that route in any way. They've got a good feel of what's going on in the business. So I think they're advising you on a number of things, from incentives where it's not working, when things go wrong, on recruiting the right people, on getting that, you know, I am not Mrs. Detail. I am the person that reads the instructions when all else fails. So actually having somebody who is there saying, you know, this is how we should set up the job description for this. You know, this is the right kind of company we've used to recruit in the past, all of that stuff. And if you work with a good outsource HR person, I think they can be as invaluable. And, you know, I've made expensive mistakes. I mean, you know, frankly, I've made all the mistakes in the book, but over the years, but actually I found ultimately using an HR professional early on helps.